The designation of reserved forests in Kuki-inhabited areas of Manipur, India, has been a contentious issue, sparking debates over legality, tribal rights, and historical land ownership. The Kuki community, one of the major tribal groups in Manipur, has raised significant objections to the state's forest policies, particularly the application of the Indian Forest Act of 1927 to declare reserved forests in their ancestral lands. These objections stem from claims that such designations are invalid due to procedural violations, disregard for tribal customary laws, and the socio-political marginalization of the Kuki people. This essay explores the reasons why the Kuki community and their representatives argue that the introduction of reserved forests in their areas is invalid, delving into historical, legal, and socio-cultural dimensions of the issue. Historical context of forest policies in Manipur. To understand the invalidity claims, it's essential to examine the historical context of forest governance in India and Manipur. The Indian Forest Act of 1927, enacted during British colonial rule, was designed to consolidate control over forest resources, primarily for revenue generation and strategic interests like timber supply. The Act categorized forests into reserved, protected, and village forests, with reserved forests being the most restricted, prohibiting activities like hunting, grazing, or cultivation unless explicitly permitted by a forest officer. This framework was inherently colonial, prioritizing state control over forests while often disregarding indigenous land rights and customary practices. In Manipur, a princely state until its integration into India in 1949, forest management was historically governed by local customs and community practices, particularly in the hill areas inhabited by tribes like the Kuki and Naga. These communities viewed themselves as sons of the soil, with land ownership rooted in oral traditions and customary laws rather than written deeds. The imposition of the Indian Forest Act post-independence extended colonial-era policies into tribal areas, often without adequate consultation with local communities. This historical disconnect between state-driven forest policies and tribal customary governance forms the backdrop for the Kuki community's grievances. The Kuki perspective, ancestral land rights. The Kuki people argue that their lands in Manipur's hill areas, particularly in districts like Churachandpur, Kangpokpi, and Ferzaul, have been communally owned and managed since time immemorial. These lands, rich in biodiversity, have sustained Kuki livelihoods through agriculture, hunting, and gathering, governed by customary laws passed down orally. Unlike the valley areas dominated by the Métis community, the hill areas were excluded from cadastral surveys, meaning formal land records were never established. Instead, land ownership was vested in village chiefs and community councils, a system recognized even during colonial times. The Kuki Inpi, the apex body representing Kuki tribes, has consistently argued that the state's designation of reserved forests in these areas disregards their ancestral rights. For instance, a memorandum submitted to the governor of Manipur in 2023 by the Kuki Inpi Kangpokpi highlighted the acute infliction on tribal communities due to forest policies, asserting that the Kuki have been rightful landholders since colonial times. The declaration of reserved forests, they claim, is an attempt to alienate them from their lands, transforming them into encroachers on their own territory. This sentiment echoes historical grievances, such as the 1883 incident in Mizoram, where Mizo tribes were killed for tapping rubber in a reserved forest, illustrating a pattern of colonial and post-colonial high-handedness against tribal communities. Legal invalidity. Procedural violations. A central argument for the invalidity of reserved forest declarations in Kuki areas is the failure to follow legal procedures mandated by the Indian Forest Act and constitutional provisions. The Act outlines a detailed process for declaring a reserved forest, including issuing a notification under Section 4, appointing a forest settlement officer to inquire into claims and objections, and finalizing the declaration under Section 20 after resolving disputes. In Manipur's hill areas, these procedures are further complicated by Article 371C of the Indian Constitution, which mandates that any legislation affecting tribal land rights must be vetted by the Hill Areas Committee, HAC. In 2021, the HAC resolved that the arbitrary extension of the Indian Forest Act's provisions to hill areas after 1972 without HAC approval was null and void. This resolution was in response to the Manipur government's use of satellite imagery to label Kuki village settlements as encroachments on protected forests, bypassing consultation with village authorities or the HAC. The Kuki INPI and other tribal bodies argue that such actions violate both the Indian Forest Act and Article 371C, rendering the declarations legally invalid. The state's failure to involve tribal councils or settle claims as per the Act's requirements further undermines the legitimacy of these designations. A notable example is the Nongmaiching Reserved Forest in Imphal East District. In 2022, during a tree plantation drive for World Environment Day, Kuki villagers from Nongmaipal violently opposed Forest Department officials, claiming authority over the land. The conflict led to arrests and fines under the Indian Forest Act, but the villagers' actions were rooted in their belief that the reserved forest status was imposed without their consent or proper legal process. The formation of the Nongmaiching Lifehamlen and its Environment Preservation Committee by local groups underscores the community's resolve to protect their sacred lands from state overreach. Sociopolitical dimensions, marginalization, and resource control. Beyond legal and procedural issues, the Kuki community perceives the reserved forest policy as part of a broader strategy to marginalize them and control valuable resources in their areas. The discovery of natural gas deposits in the Assam-Arakan Basin, particularly in Churachandpur and Fursal districts, has heightened tensions. The Kuki INPI and other tribal organizations argue that the state's forest policies are driven by majoritarian interests, particularly those of the Métis community, to gain access to these resources. The Métis' demand for scheduled tribe status, which gained momentum around 2010, is seen by Kukis as a ploy to bypass protections for tribal land rights, further fueling distrust. The state's eviction drives, such as the one conducted in Nongmaiching in 2018, are viewed as attempts to displace Kuki communities under the guise of forest conservation. These drives often target settlements labeled as encroachments, despite the lack of formal land surveys in hill areas. The Kuki INPI has condemned such actions as discriminatory, arguing that they violate the community's constitutional rights under the Fifth Schedule, which protects tribal lands from alienation. The peaceful rallies held in 2023 across Kuki-inhabited districts, including Churachandpur and Kangpokpi, were a direct response to these policies, with participants demanding the governor's intervention to halt reserve forest declarations and eviction notices. Environmental and cultural impacts. The imposition of reserved forest status also has significant environmental and cultural repercussions for the Kuki community. Environmentally, the Kuki argue that their traditional practices, such as shifting cultivation, chum, are sustainable and have preserved forest ecosystems for centuries. Declaring these lands as reserved forests restricts such practices, potentially disrupting ecological balance and local livelihoods. For instance, the prohibition of grazing and cultivation in reserved forests, as mandated by the Indian Forest Act, directly conflicts with Kuki agrarian traditions, pushing communities toward economic distress. Culturally, many Kuki areas, like Nongmaiching Ching, hold spiritual significance. The violent opposition to tree plantation drives in Nongmaiching in 2022 was partly due to the mountain's sacred status among the Métis, but also reflected Kuki resistance to state interference in their cultural landscapes. The destruction of a plantation drive backdrop and the sowing of bean seeds by villagers were symbolic acts of reclaiming authority over their land. Such incidents highlight the clash between state-imposed conservation policies and indigenous cultural values. Broader implications. Tribal autonomy and state control. The invalidity of reserved forest declarations in Kuki areas points to a larger struggle for tribal autonomy in India's northeast. The region's unique land tenure systems, where community ownership predominates, are often at odds with centralized forest governance. The mushrooming of community reserves in states like Manipur and Nagaland, as noted by forest rights activists, is seen as a backdoor entry by forest departments to assert control over tribal lands. In Manipur, where 75% of forests are under community management, such policies threaten to erode traditional governance structures. The Kuki-Meitei conflict, exacerbated by forest policies, is more than an ethnic clash. It reflects structural violence against tribal communities. The state's failure to follow constitutional safeguards, such as consulting the HAC or respecting customary laws, underscores a broader pattern of marginalization. The Kuki demand for a separate administration, voiced during the 2023 rallies, is a direct response to these grievances, seeking to protect their land rights and cultural identity against state overreach. Conclusion. The Kuki communities claim that the Forest Department's introduction of reserved forests in their areas is invalid rests on a combination of legal, historical, and socio-political grounds. Procedurally, the state's failure to adhere to the Indian Forest Act and constitutional provisions, like Article 371C, renders these declarations legally questionable. Historically, the imposition of colonial-era forest laws disregards the Kuki's ancestral land rights, rooted in customary practices. Sociopolitically, the policies are seen as tools of marginalization, driven by majoritarian interests and resource exploitation. The environmental and cultural impacts further highlight the disconnect between state conservation efforts and indigenous realities. Addressing these grievances requires a re-evaluation of forest governance in Manipur, prioritizing tribal consultation, legal compliance, and respect for customary land rights to ensure both ecological conservation and social justice.